Welcome to As a Woman, Fertility Hormones and Beyond. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Crawford, and I am a board-certified OBGYN and fertility physician, and also co-founder of Fora Fertility in Austin, Texas. Each week on this podcast, I discuss health and fertility and how they relate to your true self. Become a part of the community of collaboration that amplifies others as a woman. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome back to the As a Woman podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Crawford, and today I am answering your fertility questions. These are questions that you call and leave on the As a Woman voicemail, and I love hearing your questions. I love answering them. These are my favorite episodes. So the number you can call is 657-229-3672. Again, that is 657-229-3672, and we are going to dive into all of your questions. Today's questions are all about trying to get pregnant and understanding your body when things don't make sense. As always, I'm so thankful for all of you for your support of the podcast and all of my endeavors. You can also ask questions on Monday on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd. Every Monday, we will have a question box, we will link to content, and we will answer questions. Some of those questions will also be answered in the weekly newsletter, so make sure to sign up for the newsletter at nataliecrawfordmd.com/newsletter. On the newsletter, you'll get the Trying to Conceive Starter Guide, so you'll have a freebie. You'll also get access to some other very exciting things that are coming soon, and you'll have some special content just for you. I also answer questions at the end of regular episodes, so non-Q&A episodes. So keep asking your questions so that we can all get answers. One more time, if you have your own question, call 657-229-3672, and we're going to dive in.
Hi, Dr. Crawford. I am 32 years old and just got off of birth control after being on it for probably 15 years. I have been talking to my husband about wanting to get pregnant, and we've agreed that it's a good time. When I last went to my gynecologist appointment, I decided to have AMH testing done. And he said we could do it just to see kind of where that stands. My results were probably not ideal. It was 0.336. And so my doctor said to just kind of try naturally for probably, 6 months. And then if I don't have a positive pregnancy by then, to maybe consider seeing a specialist. I wanted to know if you agreed with that. I trust him and planning to do that, but I'm trying to get as many opinions as possible. So I wanted to know if you think I should maybe see a specialist sooner, or if I should just keep trying naturally, and if so, what's the best way to go about that as far as how to track ovulation and whether I should time it. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your podcast so much, so thank you for answering so many questions. Goodbye.
All right, this is a great question, and to be very, very honest, the answer is it depends. So I think a few important points that we should go over, all that will be addressed within this question. Number one is, should you try naturally? Should you see a specialist? Should you advance care? The answer is going to be really dependent on your goals and your own timeline. An important concept is that having a low AMH does not mean you have infertility. It does not mean that you cannot get pregnant. However, it does mean you might have less time in your reproductive window and that you will get less eggs if you're doing IVF. So we don't know if you need IVF, but if you do, you will get less eggs than your age-matched peers. So it would make sense to do that sooner than later. If we use the analogy of that vault inside the ovary that I always love, and you have a group of eggs that comes out of the vault, AMH essentially is made from the eggs that are outside the vault. So if you have 5 eggs outside the vault, or you have 20 eggs outside the vault, yes, those are different numbers. Yes, those mean you'll get different outcomes for IVF, but you ovulate 1 in each of these cycles. So your chance of getting pregnant is your age-related chance. So at age 32, that's going to be somewhere between 17 to 20% per month. So the advice of just get pregnant and see if you're okay is not wrong necessarily. However, why is your AMH low? And does that mean you might have a higher chance of having something else that could cause infertility? And how many kids do you want? Those are two very important pieces for me when I'm trying to think about what you should do. Why is your AMH low? It could be just low. This might be your natural pathway. Everybody's born with a different amount of eggs. Everybody runs out at a different rate, and this just might be what you have. It also could be low because of endometriosis, autoimmune disease, smoking cigarettes, other toxin exposure, something your mom did when she was pregnant with you that you have no control over. Or it could be the birth control pill. So this is one that is important to think about. When you've been on long-term hormonal contraception, not just the birth control pill, but that is one example, and you've not ovulated for a very long time, the ovary goes into a little bit of a hibernation stage. And the easiest way to think about this is that the cells that make AMH, which surround each follicle, are suppressed because they haven't grown in a really long time. The pathway of how many eggs you have available each month does not change, but those follicles are smaller. The ovary is in hibernation, so you kind of have to wake it up a little bit. And you might have an AMH value that's lower than it really is if you're on birth control pills, the implant, the vaginal ring, hormonal IUD. And not everybody will have this, but some people will. So if you checked this AMH value while you were on the pill, or maybe you stopped it last month, I would say, hey, studies show we could wait a couple months and repeat it, and that might give you a different perspective because now your ovary is going to be more awake. On the other hand, this might be your real value. And so when you get a low AMH and time is of the essence, depending on your family goals, it is never wrong to go see a fertility doctor. Going to see a fertility clinic and getting more of an evaluation does not mean you will be pushed into advanced treatment. However, it puts you in the position of power, where potentially you might say, hey, let's just try for 6 months, and then you're going to be sent in. And what if your partner has no sperm? What if your fallopian tubes are blocked? What if the cause of your low AMH is also endometriosis and it has resulted in distortion of your anatomy and your tubes are blocked? That sure is going to feel like those 6 months were a total waste of time and completely in vain, especially for somebody who might have a shorter reproductive window and wants more than one child. So I like data. I think it's never wrong to go see a fertility doctor, get an antral follicle count on ultrasound to confirm the AMH findings, check for potential causes. Not all causes can be identified, but you sure would hate to miss autoimmune thyroid disease or something like that. You should have a semen analysis for your partner. You should check that your fallopian tubes are open. If some of those things are not working, then do not waste your time. But often we'll check, things will be fine, and we'll say, hey, let's make a game plan. Now that we know all the parts are working, do we want to go try for 6 months and then come back if we're not pregnant? Or maybe you want to expedite care pending on something you find or your family goals. You could argue that is unnecessary testing and that the odds of finding something might be low. Potentially that is the case. Some people will absolutely get pregnant in the 6 months of just trying it naturally. It just depends where your risk-benefit ratio is and what kind of person you are and your family goals. I feel a lot more comfortable for the person who wants just one kid to just try naturally and see what happens because time isn't such a crucial variable. If you're 32 and you want 3 kids and your AMH is low, I am now really concerned about those future kiddos and how important is that family size to you? And should we consider earlier intervention? Should we freeze embryos for baby 3? Do the testing, maybe we freeze embryos, and maybe you still try naturally now. And maybe baby 1 happens fine, but we can already predict down the road that on age alone, baby 3 is going to be more difficult based on where you're starting. And if you have less eggs, and now you have a higher probability that you're going to need IVF for baby 3 based on age alone, does that make sense? If baby 3 is like a bonus baby and you say it's not that essential, less concerned. If you say I have 2 siblings and this is really important to me, I am more concerned. So this is going to be one of those scenarios where there's no right or wrong answer for everybody. It's very personalized. Your doctor is absolutely right. Go ahead and start trying and see what happens is a very reasonable response. However, alternative options would be see a fertility doctor, get testing, use that data, that testing to then make the decision that's right for you. Have an honest talk with your partner about your family goals. How many kids do you want? Share that information with your care team. And then, are there any identifiable causes of your low ovarian reserve that might play a role in this decision making? When it comes to tracking your cycle, certainly if you haven't ovulated for 15 years, it can take your ovary a little bit of time to wake up. But by 3 months, you should absolutely be ovulating. If you're not, do not pass go. Go see the fertility clinic. But presuming your cycle is coming back, there's a lot of different ways to track, and this depends on your preference. If you guys have frequent intercourse, you can have sex every 2 to 3 days, and you are going to put sperm close enough to when you're ovulating that you don't have to stress about when you are ovulating. So that's one option. If you have sex every day, just have sex every day. If you have sex every other day, just have sex every other day. If you want to track your cycles, you can use cervical mucus, basal body temperature, urinary testing. There's now so many at-home options. But what's really important for you to understand how some of these hormones work. One of my favorite options for testing is an ovulation predictor test. I have no problem with temperature. I really like it, especially if your cycles are very regular for confirmation. But if your goal is to get pregnant, and especially if you're potentially somebody who doesn't have tons of intercourse and we want to get the biggest bang for that buck, I want to know when you're ovulating. So OPKs are ovulation predictor kits. These are urinary-based LH tests. LH is released from the brain before you ovulate. It is the trigger that is sent out once the brain senses you have enough estrogen to be representative of a mature egg. From the moment you send out that LH surge, ovulation typically occurs the next day. We need to check LH, and you have to catch when it first rises, because after that surge, it's going to rise and fall and rise and fall. It's sent out in pulses throughout the entire luteal phase or the second half of the cycle. So once you get that surge, you don't need to keep testing, and you're capturing the moment from nothing, I have very little LH, to boom, there's a lot. So you have to start testing before you ovulate or before you think you are. The easiest way to do this is if we think about a typical 28-day cycle, which not all cycles are 28 days. But in general, the luteal phase is rather sat at 12 to 14 days. Let's use 14 because we want to start testing early. So if your cycle is 28 days and we say the luteal phase is 14 days, okay, that puts us at cycle day 14. That's your estimated ovulation day. You want to start using those LH tests about 5 days before so you can capture that positive. So about 5 days before that, starting on cycle day 9, would be when you would start using that ovulation predictor kit. I know the box says use your first morning urine. And it says this because it doesn't want your urine to dilute later in the day. However, LH is released from the brain in the early morning and may not be filtered through your kidneys and into your urine until a little bit later in the day. So my favorite time to check is between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Because sometimes if you're always checking morning urine, you might actually miss your surge. So if you're not getting positive, that's something to be aware of. What we're checking for is when you have that first positive, the line either says you're ovulating or it is as dark or darker than the control line. That would be considered the day of your surge, and your ovulation day would be the next day. And I would recommend you have intercourse on both of those days, day of surge and the next day, to have the highest chance of conception. Because sperm lives for up to 5 days, we also usually recommend that you have intercourse sometime in those preceding days when you are tracking your LH. It doesn't have to be every other day, it doesn't have to be every day, but again, my general rule of thumb is that you do not need to have less sex in order to get pregnant. So do not lessen your practices. There is not a benefit to save up sperm. And the last thing to say is I do agree with the recommendation not to try a full year. Importantly, At your age 32, infertility is not diagnosed until you've been trying for a year and not gotten pregnant. However, with the low AMH, knowing that time is a little more crucial, most people will be pregnant in those first 6 months. So it's extremely reasonable to say, after 6 months, now I'm going to go see a fertility doctor and fast track the evaluation. That is faster for somebody in your age. Typically, if you're 35 and older, that's when we cut that recommendation from 12 months to 6. But you can always ask for an evaluation sooner. That was an excellent question, and we covered so many important points. We're going to dive into a couple more, but reminder, the phone number, 657-229-3672, and follow along on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd.
Hi, Dr. Crawford. This is Allie. I was calling because I have been getting some tests ran and everything's been right from what my doctor's saying, but I just need to know if I need to go get a second opinion. My husband and I, we've been trying to conceive for a few months now, but I do have spotting every time after ovulation. So it'll take me a couple days after ovulation up until my period. I do have spotting. My AMH levels are supposedly fine. My AMH levels are 2.49. My progesterone, they checked that after I ovulated, is 16.5. My thyroid is 1.77. So all of that has been checked. And then I also have gotten an ultrasound as well. And my doctor said there was nothing of concern in my ultrasound. So I just didn't know if I should keep trying. I mean, obviously we're going to keep trying, but if I should get another test taken, or if there are any other tests, or just wait and just keep trying. So yeah, thank you so much for your podcast. It's been really helpful, and I hope you're able to answer my questions.
Anytime we have spotting, it always leads to a few questions. That's because spotting can both be normal and abnormal. It is not uncommon to have ovulatory spotting. If we think about what is happening at the time of ovulation, you have this follicle that grew as the egg matured, and the cells around the follicle make estrogen. Estrogen is that signal to the brain that the follicle, the egg, is mature. The brain sends out that LH surge, follicle ruptures, and egg is released. When that follicle ruptures, there's disruption to the blood supply and to some of the cells that make estrogen. So very common to have a drop in your estrogen. If you Google menstrual cycle hormones and you go look at one of the charts, you'll notice that there is a drop in that estrogen level right around the time of ovulation. But if you keep looking, that estrogen will rise again as that follicle reforms, becomes the corpus luteum, and makes both estrogen and progesterone. Because of that hormonal drop, sometimes you will have spotting, and it's just from a slight disruption of that hormone pattern. Does not mean you have any luteal phase issues or implantation issues or other concerns. However, that spotting should be very limited to that time of ovulation. You can also see implantation spotting, but implantation spotting should be about 1 week after ovulation and pretty limited, and especially you should get a positive pregnancy test. If you're constantly spotting mid-luteal, late luteal, and not getting a positive pregnancy test, that can't be just assumed to be implantation spotting. That seems more like luteal phase spotting. Spotting in the luteal phase that is constant and every cycle is concerning and does make us worry about either the production of progesterone or about the uterine lining stability. Because progesterone is made in pulses from the corpus luteum, LH pulses from the brain make the corpus luteum release progesterone in pulses. It's very hard to have a one-time progesterone blood draw in the luteal phase. Yours was 16, but that doesn't tell me that your luteal phase is good or bad. A progesterone level higher than 3 means you ovulated, but a 16 isn't better than a 10, isn't worse than a 20, because it's all about when you're checking in relation to that brain pulse. So that doesn't tell us that everything's perfect in the luteal phase. And in fact, constant luteal phase spotting is a sign something's wrong. Sometimes this is, in my opinion, the first stage of ovulatory dysfunction. I always describe this on a spectrum: perfectly normal periods, luteal phase issues, whether it's a short luteal phase or spotting, slightly longer cycles with a longer follicular phase or delayed ovulation, really long cycles or skipping months, and then no period at all. So if we really do think that this is potentially luteal phase spotting, it could be an ovulatory issue. That could be due to thyroid. It sounds like like yours is fine. It could be due to prolactin, so that's another brain hormone we would want to check. Other things are also structural. So could it be that potentially you have a polyp inside the endometrium and that is causing this spotting when the lining is trying to compact and get ready for a pregnancy to implant? Or could you have cervical dysplasia? This is when you're having intercourse. So have you had a recent pap smear? Could you have a polyp inside the uterus? A regular ultrasound does not always show this. So you often need what's called a saline sonogram, where we put water inside the uterus and watch with ultrasound. Or you can also detect this on X-ray test, which is HSG, hysterosalpingogram. Same idea, dye into the uterus, watch with X-ray, can tell you if there's a defect inside the uterus. Or hysteroscopy, which is putting a camera inside the uterus, is ultimately the gold standard. So any of these can work to detect a polyp if hormonally we think everything is fine. If everything rules out fine and we're left with maybe it's ovulatory dysfunction for unknown reason, some people might try to add on progesterone after ovulation, and that's not a wrong answer, but it's not my favorite because it's a little bit of a band-aid. If we think the problem is potentially in the ovulatory pathway, that's all related to the quality of the follicle you're growing. So my preference is actually to consider low-dose ovulation induction agents like letrozole or Clomid, and you can add on progesterone to that. That's not right or wrong, but treating the ovulatory issue is my preference over just a progesterone band-aid, but they're both fine. But you'd want to rule out other causes first. So could be totally normal implantation or ovulatory spotting, could be really that luteal spotting the whole phase or for half of your luteal phase. And if that's occurring in every cycle, definitely more concerning in my opinion, and would recommend an evaluation.
Hi, Dr. Crawford. I love your podcast, first of all. I have learned so much listening to it. So I have a question. I have been on birth control for probably 10 years, and in March I stopped it, and me and my husband has been trying ever since. And I know it's only been around 4 months, but we still have had no luck, and I'm trying to track my cycles, but they're not frequent. They're not the same. I get different numbers every month. Should I be using an ovulation test or just keep trying? And I don't know if maybe the birth control affected how I am, and maybe I do notice that I have the egg white texture, but just because you have egg whites, does that mean that my body is releasing an egg or not? I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you.
It can be really tough to start tracking your cycles and have them be irregular and try to understand what's happening. So props to you for trying to figure it out. If we go back to that idea that your cycle is a spectrum, normal, short, delayed, irregular, missing months, absent, then thinking about what's happening when you're in the irregular zone is important. You do not have a period unless you ovulate. Now you can have non-period bleeding, which is typically very different. It's not the same flow. That can happen when you have totally anovulatory cycles and the lining just builds up too much, or you have something else going on inside the uterus. But if you're getting a period, and especially if you're getting egg white discharge, what's happening is that you're ovulating, just not at a regular, predictable pattern. The birth control pills, the longer you take it, as we said, can suppress the ovaries, but when they wake up, they shouldn't be delayed or having an irregular pattern. So the fact that our body is having an irregular pattern now at 3 months after still is suggestive that maybe something else is going on, and we just were not able to detect this because we were on the birth control pill. Examples of this, or probably the most common example, is going to be PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. But you can also see ovulatory difficulties from thyroid, prolactin, being overweight. You can also see it from hypothalamic, where the brain is not sending out some of the right hormones. So there's different reasons why you can have some irregular cycles. And I think it's important to understand that you typically are ovulating. It's just so hard to predict when it's happening. So number one, I would recommend we get tested because if it's thyroid or prolactin, you need medication for that. If, however, we're just trying to track, when you look at these cycle patterns, you tend to ovulate about 2 weeks before that period begins. And if that's when you're noticing that egg white discharge, then that is a confirmation of the high estrogen levels with the egg. And you can just say, I'm going to wait to see that and have sex. And that's a really good marker. People who have intercourse on the day of the sticky egg white, that actually has a high rate of success. But it can be really frustrating to be waiting for that and not knowing, and should you have sex or should you not, and what if you miss it? So I think one thing is, if you have regular sex or you are getting that sticky egg white, especially if that's 2 weeks before when your period is coming, you can just have sex. You are ovulating. It's not perfect, but you're ovulating. When we start thinking about tracking our cycles with other methods, it can be frustrating to use, ovulation kits or daily testing or temperature when your periods are irregular. So I always think, look back at these period patterns. Is it really coming really different cycle lengths? 30, 45, 37, 50. That's hard. Or is it simply just really long, which isn't ideal, but a little bit more regular? Those actually are different scenarios, and I might think differently in both of those. So I think the take home is that it sounds like you are ovulating. Birth control pills are out of your system very fast, so it's not causing this problem, and our ovaries should be awake by now. So I always say you're entitled to 1 or 2 weird months. So you could see what happened the month after. Now that you're in month 3 and 4, how do things look? But if we are having an irregular cycle, let's go get evaluated and find out what is going on. To me, based on the information provided, it does sound like you're ovulating. It just sounds like potentially it's a little irregular or longer, and there might be something we can do that could improve that process. But we've got to get to the bottom of what's going on first. All right, everybody, thank you so much for all your wonderful questions. These were all really excellent and loved hearing them. Please ask more questions. So I always love when you call in with your questions, and you can call the voicemail at 657-229-3672. Again, that is 657-229-3672. Or you can follow along on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd and leave your question every Monday. Those questions will be answered on Instagram. They will be answered at the end of our other podcast episodes, and they will be answered in the newsletter. So when you go to the newsletter, for that, you can go to nataliecrawfordmd.com/newsletter and sign up, and you will get the TTC Starter Guide. This is a nice handout, but if you look at it, we talk all about the different options for cycle tracking. So if some of the things we talked about, like ovulation predictor kits or cervical mucus or temperature and progesterone, was a little bit confusing, that is a great option where you can go and really look at them all and understand it a little bit better. Also, don't forget that on the resources page of the website, you are going to be able to search any topic. So if you want to learn more about low AMH or irregular periods, you can go to nataliecrawfordmd.com and you'll go to the resources tab. You will be able to put in and search for any topic, and you'll find all of the content that I've made regarding that topic, whether it's podcast, YouTube, or blog posts. So my mission is to help you. If you are in the middle of trying to get pregnant or undergoing fertility treatments, please check out the courses. We've got a great community and so much valuable information in the Enhance Your Natural Fertility course and the IVF guide. Thank you, friends. Thank you all for listening to As a Woman. It would mean so much if you could rate, review, and follow the podcast to be notified of new episodes every Sunday. I hope you learned something new, and I hope you share it with someone in your life. Be sure to follow along on Instagram at nataliecrawfordmd and check out the YouTube channel Natalie Crawford MD. If you're interested in becoming a patient, you can also follow Fora Fertility. I'm so thrilled to have you here, part of the community that amplifies others as a woman.